One moment. I'm going to set up the recording here. So how's everybody doing tonight? Can you hear me okay? Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining the housing breakout session. My name is Chase Haller. I am a staff attorney and director of housing and consumer protection at the Neighborhood Christian Legal Clinic. For tonight's breakout session, I'm going to be speaking about the importance of home, a place many of us have been spending a lot of time lately. I'll start this evening with a passage from Matt Desmond's book, Evicted. The home is the center of life. It is a refuge from the grind of work, the pressure of school, and the menace of the streets. We say that at home we can be ourselves. Everywhere else, we are someone else. At home, we remove our masks, a phrase that has an entirely different meaning today. The home is the wellspring of personhood. It is where our identity takes root and blossoms, where as children we imagine, play, and question, and as adolescents we retreat and try. As we grow older, we hope to settle into a place to raise a family or pursue our work. When we try to understand ourselves, we often begin by considering the kind of home in which we were raised. In languages spoken all over the world, the word home encompasses not just shelter, but warmth, safety, family, the womb. The ancient Egyptian hieroglyph for home was often used in place of mother. The Chinese word jia can mean both family and home. Shelter comes from two old English words, skilt meaning shield, and truma meaning troop, together forming the image of a family gathering itself within a protective shell. The home remains the primary basis of all life. The central theme of Matt Desmond's book, Evicted, is that eviction functions as a cause, not just a condition of poverty. What does that mean? It means that eviction is often a causal event, ripping families from their foundation, destroying their security, tearing at their deepest fears, that they would not be able to protect themselves and their families with a stable roof over their heads. What does the research tell us about evictions? It tells us that the likelihood of being laid off is 15% higher for workers who have experienced an eviction. Housing authorities may count evictions and unpaid debts as strikes against an applicant, cutting off access to much-needed rental assistance programs. In the year following an eviction, families face 20% higher levels of material hardship, not able to afford things like food or medical care or the ability to pay for basic utilities. Those with an involuntary move are often forced to rent from bad landlords in even worse neighborhoods, perpetuating the cycle of poverty and injustice. Housing displacement is also a threat to strong communities with a focus on civic life. Alexis de Tocqueville, a French observer of mid-18th century America, noted, "It is difficult to force a man out of himself and get him to take an interest in the affairs of the whole state. But if it is a question of taking a road past his property, he sees at once that this small public matter has a bearing on his greatest private interests." Desmond, in his book Evicted, notes, "It is only after we begin to see a street as our street, a public park as our park, a school as our school, that we can become engaged citizens, dedicating our time and resources for worthwhile causes. Things like joining the neighborhood watch, volunteering to beautify a playground, or even running for school board." Housing displacement destroys that civic engagement, casting families into a cycle of fear and indecision. Where can I afford to go? Where will my children go to school? How can I find meaningful work close to where I live? There's no time to take ownership of a community when a person doesn't feel that they truly have one. I'm going to walk you through a few client experiences of injustice related to housing. The first was an eviction client. I began working in housing and consumer justice at the clinic in early 2012. I started conducting intakes at our main office every Wednesday for housing and consumer issues. One day, I encountered an elderly woman who showed me her rent-to-own contract for the house she thought she was buying and she proceeded to tell me about all the problems she was experiencing: a contract she could not understand, significant repair issues, and a company who was trying to kick her out. I visited the property. She said, "It isn't much, but it's my home." I observed the ceiling bubbling in her kitchen from years of water intrusion, water being collected in buckets in her attic when it rained, and a toilet that had been repaired by the company that had connected it to a hot water line. They charged her rental account for those and other repairs, causing her to fall behind and pyramiding late fees, and they sued her for eviction. Second client was a client facing foreclosure. Along with landlord-tenant cases, I started my career at the clinic representing borrowers facing foreclosure during the mortgage crisis and the ensuing Great Recession. My client was a Vietnam veteran who several months earlier had stopped paying his bills, stopped taking calls from family members, didn't open his mail, and he didn't care for his personal hygiene. He would soon find out that the cause of these personality and behavioral changes was actually a brain tumor the size of a softball. Thankfully, it was operable and he was treated with few side effects. His loan servicer, however, decided that they could not connect the tumor that was recently operated on to his mortgage default that happened several months earlier. So they told him they wouldn't be offering him a loan modification. The last client was also a foreclosure client. He was a retired postal worker, and despite all of our attempts to save his home from foreclosure, he was denied for assistance. He had significant equity in the home, but in a moment of weakness a few days prior to the sheriff's sale, he was approached by a home flipper who offered to buy his home for the cost of the judgment and give him a couple $1,000s to walk away. He signed the agreement before he discussed it with me, and he just didn't know what to do. So what does the Bible tell us about injustice and protecting the vulnerable? Tim Keller provided some observations in his article, A Biblical Critique of Secular Justice and Critical Theory. While we are not to show partiality to any, Leviticus 19:15 tells us, "Do not pervert justice, do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly." We are to have a special concern for the powerless. This is not a contradiction. Proverbs 31:8-9 says, "Speak up for those who can't speak for themselves. Defend the rights of the poor and needy." The Bible doesn't say, "Speak up for the rich and powerful," not because they are less important as persons before God, but because they don't need you to do this. The playing field is not level, and if we don't advocate for the poor, there will not be equality. In this aspect of justice, we are seeking to give more social, financial, and cultural capital or power to those with less. Jeremiah 22:3 says, "Protect the person who is being cheated from the one who is mistreating, foreigners, orphans, or widows." Jeremiah is singling out for protection groups of people who can't protect themselves from mistreatment the way others can. The Bible tells us that we are charged to do these things, but it isn't always clear exactly how. So I want to go back to the stories that I told you earlier and talk about how the clinic sought justice for those clients. For the elderly woman facing eviction, we stood up to the company and demanded that they cease collection and allow her to move with dignity. A year ago, that company's business model was rejected by the Indiana Supreme Court as illegal. We filed an amicus brief in the case supporting that decision. For the Vietnam veteran facing foreclosure, we filed a formal complaint with the Veterans Administration Loan Escalation Department. Several weeks later, the client received a loan modification. For the foreclosure client, whose equity was being stolen from him, we advised him on how to proceed, and instead of walking away with $2,000, he received over $70,000 from the sale of his home at sheriff's sale. That gave him money to start a new life. We petitioned the court for the proceeds and hand-delivered the check to him. These are only my personal experiences. These client victories are amplified each and every day by our foreclosure counselors, our attorneys and support staff, and our volunteers. Even in cases where our clients experience great loss or a wrong that may not be righted, we will walk alongside them and help them to know that they are not alone. So I want to talk about what's happening today. A wave of foreclosures and evictions is coming. In fact, it's already started. The Indianapolis Neighborhood Housing Partnership recently commissioned a study to estimate the scale of COVID-19 disruption on evictions and foreclosures. Their research suggests that 17,919 homeowners with a mortgage in Marion County, or 15.2% of homeowners, may be at a heightened risk of foreclosure. While households owned by people of color comprise only 38% of total households, they represent 45.9% of the households at higher risk for foreclosure. Similarly, 30,037 renter households, or 22% of all renters, are at a heightened risk of eviction under the current economic circumstances. 52.2% of renter households at risk of heightened risk of eviction are households of color, despite only comprising 21.8% of the total amount of renter households. So there's an enormous disparate impact on these communities. The crisis is being felt the hardest by our low-income neighbors and by communities of color. Communities that lost millions of dollars in family wealth during the foreclosure crisis are now facing an economic crisis that could impact them for years to come. The poor, the foreigner, the widow. These are the people that God singles out as needing our protection. So we need you to join with us. We need your help to fight injustice and housing instability. These examples of hope for clients facing housing instability do not exist by coincidence. They exist because of supporters just like you, people who hear the call to justice and to serve the poor and the marginalized. Through your gifts, you allow us to provide the witness of Christ to our neighbors in dire need by walking alongside them and defending their cause. Through your volunteer efforts, you give us more time to help more people by helping with intake. By taking cases for representation, you are scaling our ability to help the poor when grant funding simply will not meet the need. We can rise to the challenge, but we cannot do it alone. So we ask that you please help us to continue to provide justice and housing stability to our neighbors in need. And with that, I'd like to close this with prayer. God, we know that you care about peace and housing stability for your people. In Isaiah 32:18, you tell us that your people will live in peaceful dwelling places, in secure homes, in undisturbed places of rest. Heavenly Father, give us wisdom to discern how to rise to meet the needs of our neighbors facing housing instability. Give them peace, give them justice, and give them advocates, and call on us in their time of need. Amen. So thank you all for joining the housing segment this evening. I'm trying to see if I recognize any names here. I recognize several. I think this person named Megan Haller might be my wife, but I'm not sure. Thank you all for joining. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the presentation. So